past is centuries or moments ago. History has no orphans. Each event is a child of those that preceded it. On May 7th, 1945, Hitler's surviving deputies surrendered the Third German Reich to Great Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. But peace did not come. The victorious Soviet armies were sprawled across Eastern Europe, and they swiftly moved to seize power in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. By 1948, all democratic political opposition in Eastern Europe had been eliminated. Stalin had created a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the Western nations. 30 Russian divisions stood ready in Eastern Europe for more conquest, backed up by 60 more divisions in the Soviet Union. March of 1948, in response to this clear threat from the East, a group of European nations signed a treaty of alliance in Brussels. And less than a year later, in April 1949, the United States and Canada joined 10 Western European nations in signing the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington. Greece, Turkey, West Germany, and Spain joined the alliance later. The parents of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, were the democratic ideals of its founders and the threat to those ideals posed by the Soviet Union. The harsh reality of that threat has been repeatedly demonstrated between 1949 and today. And yet, new events and new generations change perspectives on old causes. In the United States, there are debates as to whether our European allies are bearing their fair share of the costs and burdens for the defense of Europe. Demonstrations in Germany, Britain, the Netherlands, and other countries cause many Americans to question the European commitment to the NATO alliance. In this final quarter of the 20th century, these questions and doubts about NATO, which was born in the second quarter of the century, weigh heavily on many American minds. These questions and doubts will be our subject for the next half hour. Europe is a densely populated area of 33 countries, if the Vatican is included. A jagged line running from the Norwegian-Soviet border on the Barents Sea to the Turkish-Soviet border beyond the Black Sea separates Eastern and Western Europe. The territory to the east is dominated by a single political system. Western Europe has lived in its diversity beside that monolith for over a generation. Anders Josta is the defense minister of Norway. He enjoys that particular clarity of vision that comes from his country's immediate proximity to the Soviet Union.
We are bordering the Soviet Union, and the only country besides Turkey which is in that position. The largest Soviet fleet, the Northern Fleet, is situated about 10 miles from the Norwegian border. So I think to the security of the whole alliance, the United States included, Norway and the northern flank of NATO is of crucial importance. Norway would be able to mobilize more than 300,000 people. That is, in fact, as many as there are Americans in Europe right now. The alliance have ready forces in all West European countries that could take the brunt of the first invasion. 70 to 80% of all in-place forces in Europe are European. Ever since the alliance was formed, it has been predicted that it would die. It has lived and it has protected all alliance countries for a long time, and we have been able to maintain freedom, and that is really what NATO is all about.
I'm at a radar station on a Danish island in the Baltic Sea, a part of the NATO early warning system in Northern Europe. Poland is 50 nautical miles to the south, East Germany 50 to the southwest, and the Soviet Union is 150 miles southeast of here. These radar scopes behind me are tracking air activity over the Baltic. Between here and the Turkish-Soviet border, thousands of miles to the south, the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies have 173 divisions and 2,300 nuclear missile warheads aimed at targets in Western Europe, 3,000 nuclear-capable aircraft, 42,000 tanks and sophisticated intelligence equipment, all facing Western Europe. These are the permanent facts of life that NATO governments, European and North American, have to live with. It is isolated on this Danish island in the Baltic Sea. The congealing of Europe into two mutually antagonistic spheres is now remote in time. The Soviets' consolidation of the East took place over a generation ago. This wall in Berlin, built by East Germany to keep her citizens from escaping to the West, is now older than many of the men and women who serve in the forces of NATO. This divided city is a microcosm of a divided Europe. The view from here makes the violent past and the imperatives of NATO's present defense posture on the east-west border both graphic and personal. Richard von Weizsäcker is the mayor of West Berlin. He has some very definite thoughts about the alliance, about defense, and Europe.
Freedom is not something cheap. It's not a gift inherited and needing no investment, no effort. So everything which we call security is essential in the sense that on the other side of the wall, all responsible political people very clearly know that we are both able and ready to defend this freedom against anyone. It has been not the Americans who wanted to force upon us Europeans or us Germans new weapons or the modernization of missiles, but it has been the Europeans who asked for some means of balancing the growing superiority of the Soviets in the field of the medium-range missiles. We have to see to it that our defense is working properly, that it is accepted by our people, and that burdens are properly shared. And I think especially here in Berlin, where we know so well how essential it is to keep freedom, and where we will never forget to whom we owe the safeguarding of that freedom, at the same time, we do wish not to cut all kinds of lines and communications with the people on the other side. And that may perhaps not be described very well by the term of détente, but by the effort of not adding to the wall of stones a wall of complete cut of all kinds of communication.
For most of the 19th century, America didn't have any foreign policy. We traded abroad, squabbled with Britain over our Civil War, but for the most part, we were engrossed in discovering and settling a new continent, and we largely ignored the rest of the world. That was the genesis of the American isolationist dream. It was shattered forever by World Wars I and II, and the political and military roles that America played around the world in the decades following those catastrophic events. But new generations without direct experience of the past grew up in this country too. After the Vietnam War, a new political weariness with the United States' global military and political role began to express itself. In addition, the economic boom of the 50s and 60s began to deflate, and in the early 1980s, a severe recession resulted in the worst unemployment since the Great Depression half a century ago. Suffering the stringencies of a half-immobilized economy, the resentment of some Americans over high defense budgets needed a rationale. A common and convenient complaint was, our allies aren't paying their share of the costs of defending Europe. Senator George Mitchell, Democrat of Maine, is a member of the Senate Finance Committee. He served as an intelligence officer in Berlin in the 1950s.
Well, we are carrying a major burden, but we have to understand that we are acting in what we perceive to be our self-interest. We learned through the difficult and painful process of the Second World War that the defense of American freedom and liberty does not end on the American coastline. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a cooperative effort, a true alliance of several Western nations in their common defense, recognizing that in the modern world, especially with modern armies and weapons of destruction, that no nation ought to be standing alone against the threat to its own sovereignty and the liberty of its people. Nothing is perfect, obviously, and there will continue to be an evolving relationship, continue to be efforts to involve more of the Western nations in a greater effort, but surely the NATO nations are making a major effort in their own defense. They are providing over 90% of the manpower on the ground in Western Europe. They're providing the overwhelming majority of the equipment that's used in NATO, tanks, planes. The American contribution is a very small portion of the total there. And while we have to continue in an evolving relationship, I think Americans must recognize that the European nations are just as committed to the defense of their liberty as we are to ours.
Senator Charles Mathias, Republican of Maryland, is chairman of the Senate Rules Committee and a member of the Foreign Relations Committee.
The question of burden sharing is debated in the Congress almost every year on the principle that somehow or other the burden is not equitably divided up. And you could show that some nations are not spending as much money as others. But I think what is clear is that every one of the nations is bearing a heavy burden for the common defense. In the last few years, the European defense expenditures have gone up rather dramatically. And during some of those years, at least, the 70s, the United States defense expenditures were going down.
Inherent in these American attitudes we've been discussing is a feeling that if there is a war in Europe, Americans will have to pay for it with American dollars and American lives because our European allies are not doing their share. Quite the opposite is true. From the beginning, our European partners in the alliance have carried a substantial share of NATO's defense burden in contributions of troops, materials, and territory. Turkey alone has over 800,000 troops committed to the alliance, a number second only to the United States. Michael Heseltine, the British Minister of Defense, is the government's chief spokesman in defense policy.
The ready forces in Europe for the alliance, the European allies provide 90% of the ground forces, 90% of the armored divisions, 80% of the combat aircraft, 80% of the tanks. It's not a bad start. The second thing that I think it's quite important to say, and I can understand how it's not so easily understood to an American audience. You see, we've been increasing our defense expenditure consistently. The support for NATO in this country is one of the most certain convictions that exist in British politics. If you look at the opinions of the British people about NATO, you see that something between 74 to 77, 78% are in favor of NATO. Now, anyone who knows anything about the measurement of public opinion knows that that is a heck of a proportion of support. If you then look to see what the British people feel about the principal policy of NATO, which is strong conventional defence backed by nuclear deterrence, that carries quite similar degrees of support. So the British will is very, very substantial in support of the NATO alliance. Underlying all the arguments, there is that rock of certainty that the North Atlantic Alliance is incomparably the best guarantee of our peace.
Giovanni Spadolini is a distinguished historian, a former Prime Minister of Italy, presently her defense minister. He understands the roots of the East-West conflict, and as a statesman, he's dealt with it for over a dozen years.
Non c'è dubbio che negli ultimi anni di aggravate difficoltà economiche.
There is no doubt that in these recent years of burdensome economic difficulties, honoring our commitments to the alliance has cost Italy dearly. The costs to the European economic community have also been great. But as Europeans and Westerners, we know quite well what the Atlantic Pact has meant over the last 35 years in terms of defense, peace, and coexistence. History tells us that the objectives pursued by the alliance are well worth the sacrifices.
L'Alleanza Atlantica persegue non è un legame soltanto militare.
It is not just a military bond. The alliance was born at the time of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union of Stalin's day. We all know that as it has evolved, the Soviet Union has undergone complex and difficult setbacks, which make today's picture completely different from what it was. But the basis of the Atlantic Alliance still lies in one fundamental idea: the defense of freedom and democracy. If I had to define the philosophy that binds the nations on both sides of the Atlantic, I would say that it is our belief in political freedom.
General Cor de Jager is the chairman of the NATO Military Committee and a career officer in the Royal Netherlands Armed Forces.
And not so long ago, I was in Norway, and there I was at the very northern flank. And there was an outpost at the Berendszee, and there was a group of soldiers, 5 or 6, standing there, bitter cold, looking outside what was going on. And then I had a talk with them. They were very good motivated. And then at last we had a talk with each other, and I said, well, you must realize that many, many millions colleagues of you are standing behind you. You are standing here alone in the dark, looking over the waters, seeing if something is happening, but you are acting here on behalf of whole Europe and the United States. Because in my opinion, it is without any doubt that a lost Europe will be the end for the United States as well, and vice versa. We need each other. Many times you are confronted when you make a presentation somewhere or you have a discussion, and especially the people who have seen a war or were very close to a war, they say never again. And that's a very good motivation just to try to avoid another war. And sometimes people are thinking that we are preparing for one. No, that's just the opposite, because we know what a war is like. We just don't want anyone more. And that needs some effort, and you have to do something for that. You have to train for that, because it is not coming by itself.
Giovanni Agnelli is board chairman of Fiat, the giant Italian automakers, and he's one of the most influential businessmen in Western Europe. He is therefore deeply concerned with NATO, both as an Italian citizen and as a businessman.
NATO is both in the interests of Europe and the United States. Where is Europe situated? What risks does it run? And what kind of shared burdening does it accept? We are on the border, practically, of the Soviet Union. The second consideration is, how much does this defense cost us? And how fair is the sharing of the burden of this defense? The feeling is that the sharing is fair and that the cost is acceptable. Businessmen are always out for seeing what practical can come out of it. So they consider NATO a necessity. They know the future of Europe will be totally undefended, and the survival of Europe will be in great difficulty without NATO.
In 1833, General Karl von Clausewitz laid down the most famous dictum about war of modern times. It is, he said, an extension of politics by other means. These NATO troops and the strategies they serve are here so that the intricate and enormously difficult problems of reconciling the political views of Eastern Europe and the West can proceed without an explosive extension into open warfare. Deterrence is not an end in itself. It's a way of guaranteeing an interregnum of non-belligerence until permanent peace can be attained and believed in. Dr. Manfred Werner is the Defense Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany. A lawyer, a man vastly knowledgeable in history and active in current German politics, he brings a broad and deeply felt perspective to Germany and Western Europe's commitment to NATO.
First of all, I do not see the danger of a war as long as NATO stays together and stays strong. That means as long as our defense posture is okay. I do not see any danger of war because the Soviets will not take the risk. Looking at Northern European region, we have 100% of the naval air forces, 60% of the navy. We have 50% land forces. We Germans, we have about 50% of the land-based air defense here in Central Europe. We have now agreed with the Americans to have wartime host nation support, an additional German corps of 93,000 men in wartime for logistical support for the American reinforcement troops. We have more than 700,000 reserve troops, nearly 450,000 territorial army, and some burdens which you normally do not discuss in the United States. We have about 400,000 foreign troops on our territory. It means 5,000 exercises outside maneuver area annually on our soil, which you could possibly not imagine in the United States. NATO is the only means of keeping our freedom and keeping the peace in Europe. And our contribution will be, as it was, material, personal, and political. It means solidarize the West, show the Soviet Union that there is no means of dividing the United States and Europe.
History must be reckoned in two ways, by what happened and what did not happen. Since 1945, there has been no East-West war in Europe. That war didn't happen because NATO is there, a vigilant, highly competent line of defense. The security of Western Europe is NATO's cause. The security of many countries living under a great diversity of political systems, but joined by a commitment to democracy and freedom. Each of these European countries has a strong sense of its individuality, but they also have a collective sense of themselves as components of Western Europe. They stand geographically between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and they are aware of that dangerous juxtaposition. Margaret Thatcher, now Prime Minister of her second conservative British government, has been an activist stateswoman in an unusually stormy period of European and East-West history.
Well, I find no fragility in the commitment to NATO at all. And if you were to go out in the streets, you'd find almost everyone would say it is absolutely vital that we stand together. It's based on having learned the lessons of the past. It's based on the fact that it's weakness that causes wars. We know that NATO has kept the peace in Europe for nearly 40 years. That it's NATO that is the true peace movement. And this, I think, is almost deep in the feeling of every person in the United Kingdom and on the continent. NATO has not only stopped nuclear war, it stopped conventional war too. And let's never slip into the belief that somehow conventional war is rather more cozy and comfortable. It is terrible. And NATO has prevented that from recurring again in Europe. What I believe we can come to is an understanding between East and West, that we live on the same planet, breathe the same air, and conflict is not in the interest of any of our peoples. Yes, we will believe in defending our way of life, but I'm quite certain we have to come to an understanding with the Soviet Union. We owe that to freedom and justice everywhere. We owe that to our people. And we owe it to theirs. Because there was a marvelous saying by one of the Hungarians to say that you people who are free have responsibility to the people the world over. Their hope lies in you defending your freedom. Their hope lies in the conscience of the free world.
There is no reason to doubt the strength and depth of the European commitment to NATO. In the realities of troops and materials, territory for basing NATO forces, and above all in the dimensions of that commitment, Europe is contributing its full share toward the protection of democracy and freedom. For more than a generation, the NATO partnership has constrained the savageries of war in Europe, war that would inevitably draw the United States into its vortex. And the NATO partnership will remain until all of our arts in the construction of true peace will ensure that the war which never happened never will.